Sometimes the cruelest thing about being poor isn't the hunger. It's the way folks look right through you like you don't exist. Eliza Granger learned that lesson the hard way when the shopkeeper in Dustwell threw her off his porch for asking to buy flour with what little coin she had. She hit the dirt street hard, her worn dress catching on a nail, while townsfolk turned away in shame or indifference. But one man didn't turn away. Boone Carver, the richest cattle rancher in 3 counties, stepped forward and offered his hand. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "take my hand. You'll never go hungry again." What could drive a millionaire to risk his reputation for a stranger's dignity? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The town of Dustwell sat like a weathered saddle on the vast Texas plains, its wooden buildings bleached gray by decades of unforgiving sun and wind. Main Street stretched barely 3 blocks, lined with establishments that had seen better days. Murphy's Saloon with its swinging doors that never quite closed right, the barber shop where old Pete had been cutting hair since before the war, and Grimsby's general store, where pride mattered more than profit, and kindness was a luxury few could afford. It was August of 1887, and the heat hung over the town like a heavy wool blanket. Dust devils danced in the distance, stirring up memories of better times when cattle drives brought prosperity and hope. Now, with the railroad bypassing Dustwell in favor of larger settlements, the town clung to life like a rider on a bucking bronco, determined but uncertain how much longer they could hold on. Eliza Granger had lived with uncertainty longer than most. At 28, she carried herself with the quiet dignity of a woman who had learned to find strength in small victories. Her late husband, Thomas, had been a charming man with soft hands and big dreams, neither of which proved useful when gambling debts came calling. He died 3 winters past, leaving her with nothing but a 1-room cabin on the edge of town and the kind of poverty that made neighbors cross the street rather than meet your eyes. She stood now outside Grimsby's store, smoothing her calloused hands over the faded blue cotton of her dress. It had been her Sunday best once, back when she and Thomas first arrived in Dustwell with hopes of starting fresh. The fabric was thin enough now to see through in places, and she'd mended the hem so many times it looked like a sampler of different threads. But it was clean, pressed with care, and it was what she had. The coins in her small cloth purse clinked softly as she counted them again. 17 cents, earned by taking in Mrs. Henderson's washing and mending Mr. Patterson's work shirts. Enough for a pound of flour, and perhaps a small tin of lard if Grimsby was feeling generous with his prices. She'd been stretching the last of her supplies for nearly a week, making do with water and the few wild onions that grew behind her cabin. Harold Grimsby emerged from the shadows of his store like a spider sensing movement in his web. He was a thin man with narrow shoulders and a perpetually sour expression, as if he'd been weaned on vinegar instead of milk. His store was the only mercantile for 20 miles, and he wielded that monopoly like a weapon against anyone who couldn't pay in full, in advance, with interest. "Mrs. Granger," he said, not bothering to tip his hat or offer any courtesy. "Come to beg again?" "I've come to buy supplies, Mr. Grimsby." Eliza's voice remained steady despite the heat rising in her cheeks. "I have coin." Grimsby's laugh was as dry as the dust swirling around their feet. 17 cents. You think that's enough to shop in my establishment? I've got paying customers to serve, not charity cases looking for handouts. "I'm not asking for charity," Eliza said, her chin lifting slightly. "I'm offering to pay fair price for what I need." Fair price. Grimsby stepped closer, his breath reeking of stale tobacco and meanness. Fair price for a woman whose husband owed half the county money before he had the good sense to die? Fair price for someone who's been living off scraps and the kindness of folks too polite to say no? You want fair, Mrs. Granger. Fair is you getting yourself out of my sight before you drive away real customers. The words hit Eliza like physical blows, but she stood her ground. Around them she could feel the town watching. Mrs. Coleman paused her sweeping, young Jimmy Peterson stopped his whittling, and even the stray dogs seemed to sense the tension crackling in the air. "Please," Eliza said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I just need flour and lard. I can pay." Grimsby's face twisted with disgust. "I said get out." He placed his hands on her shoulders and shoved hard, sending her stumbling backward. Her heel caught on the warped boards of the porch, and she tumbled toward the street, her precious coins scattering like startled birds. That's when she felt it. The sharp bite of metal against cloth as her dress caught on a protruding nail, tearing a strip of fabric from her skirt. She hit the ground hard, palms scraping against the rough dirt, and lay there for a moment, stunned by the suddenness of it all. The scattered coins winked in the harsh sunlight. 17 cents that had represented hope now spread across the dusty street like broken promises. Eliza remained on her hands and knees, staring at those coins, feeling the weight of every eye upon her. The silence stretched like a taut rope, broken only by the creak of Grimsby's porch boards as he stood over her like a conquering general. It was Mrs. Coleman who moved first, stepping forward with her broom still in hand. But she stopped after 2 steps, glancing nervously at Grimsby's storefront, then at the other, faces peering from windows and doorways. The unspoken rule was clear: don't cross Harold Grimsby if you wanted to keep shopping at the only store in town. That's when Boone Carver pushed himself away from the post where he'd been standing. He was a tall man, broad through the shoulders, with silver threading through his dark hair, despite being only 35. His clothes spoke of money, not the flashy kind that demanded attention, but the quiet wealth that came from good leather, fine wool, and boots made to last a lifetime. He'd been watching the scene unfold with the same sick fascination that draws people to watch a building burn, but something in the way Eliza held herself, even sprawled in the dirt, stirred something deep in his chest. Boone had seen plenty of cruelty in his life. Growing up on a ranch, he'd witnessed nature's harsh indifference, and building his cattle empire had required its share of hard decisions. But there was something about watching a woman be humiliated for the crime of needing help that cut through his usual detachment like a knife through silk. He'd lost his own wife, Sarah, 2 years prior to fever, and with her had gone his capacity for joy, for hope, for caring about much beyond the day-to-day business of moving cattle and making money. He'd thrown himself into work with the desperate energy of a man trying to outrun his grief, building his fortune as if wealth could somehow fill the hollow spaces Sarah's death had carved in his soul. But watching Eliza gather her scattered coins with trembling fingers, he remembered something Sarah had told him once. "The measure of a man isn't how much he can take, Boone. It's how much he's willing to give when giving costs him something." Boone stepped into the street, his boots crunching softly on the hard-packed earth. The townspeople held their breath as he approached. Everyone knew who Boone Carver was, and everyone knew his money spoke louder than Grimsby's pride. He knelt beside Eliza, careful not to startle her, and began gathering the scattered coins with the same gentle precision he might use to handle a newborn calf. "Ma'am," he said softly, pressing the 17 cents into her palm, "allow me." He stood and turned to face Grimsby, who had gone pale as milk. "Harold," Boone said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man accustomed to being heard. "Mrs. Granger would like to make a purchase?" "Now see here, Carver," Grimsby stammered, "this ain't your concern. I'm making it my concern." Boone's tone remained conversational, but steel ran through it like a blade through velvet. "Mrs. Granger needs supplies. You're going to provide them, fair price, good measure, and with the respect due any paying customer." Grimsby's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. Boone Carver owned more land than any 3 men in the county. His cattle filled the rails that brought prosperity to neighboring towns, and his word carried weight with banks, politicians, and anyone else who mattered in this part of Texas. "Of course, Mr. Carver," Grimsby finally managed. There seems to have been a misunderstanding. Indeed there was." Boone extended his hand to Eliza, palm up, patient as sunrise. "Ma'am, take my hand. You'll never go hungry again." Eliza looked up at him, this stranger whose kindness felt foreign after so much cruelty. His eyes were grey as storm clouds, but warm, and his hand was steady and strong. She placed her dusty palm in his and allowed him to help her to her feet. "Mrs. Granger," Boone said, brushing the dust from her elbow with surprising gentleness, "would you allow me to accompany you inside? I believe Mr. Grimsby has some apologizing to do, along with providing you the finest supplies in his store." As they walked toward the store, Eliza's torn dress fluttering behind her like a banner of resilience, the town of Dustwell witnessed something remarkable. Not just an act of kindness, but the first stirring of something that would change them all. Neither Boone nor Eliza could have imagined that this moment of unexpected grace would grow into something far larger than either of them had dared to dream. Inside Grimsby's store, the air hung thick with the scents of leather, tobacco, and the faint mustiness of goods that had sat too long on shelves. Eliza had never been inside before. Her previous attempts to shop had always ended at the threshold, dismissed before she could cross into the realm of paying customers. Now, walking beside Boone Carver, she marveled at the abundance that surrounded her. Sacks of flour and sugar stood like white sentinels along the wall, while barrels of pickles and molasses promised sustenance beyond her recent experience. Bolts of fabric and colors she'd almost forgotten, deep blues, forest greens, warm yellows, lined the shelves like captured rainbows. The sight of such plenty made her stomach clench with a hunger that went deeper than physical need. "Now then, Mrs. Granger," Grimsby said, his voice oily with false courtesy as he scurried behind his counter, "what can I get for you today? Finest flour in 3 counties, fresh lard, whatever you might need." Eliza stood frozen, overwhelmed by choices she hadn't been permitted to make in years. Boone sensed her hesitation and stepped closer, not touching but offering his presence like an anchor. "Perhaps we might start with basics," he suggested gently. "A good-sized sack of flour, lard for cooking, some beans and coffee if you take it." "I couldn't possibly," Eliza began, but Boone held up a hand. "Mrs. Granger, I have a proposition for you." He turned to face her fully, his gray eyes serious. "I'm in need of someone to help manage my household. My ranch is large, but I live simply. Too simply, perhaps. I need someone to cook proper meals, keep the house in order, maybe tend a garden. In exchange, you'd have a room of your own, regular meals, and a fair wage besides." Eliza's heart hammered against her ribs like a caged bird. The offer was generous beyond anything she could have imagined, but generosity without understanding the cost was dangerous territory for a woman in her position. "Mr. Carver," she said carefully, "that's very kind, but I couldn't accept charity disguised as employment." "It's not charity," Boone replied, and something in his voice made her believe him. "I've been living on beans and hardtack for 2 years because I can't cook worth a damn, and I'm tired of eating like a man who's given up on living. I need help, Mrs. Granger, and from what I've observed, you're exactly the kind of person who understands that work has dignity." Grimsby cleared his throat loudly, reminding them of his presence. "Shall I wrap up some supplies, then, on Mr. Carver's account?" "No," Eliza said firmly, surprising them both. She reached into her small purse and placed her 17 cents on the counter. "I'll pay for what I can afford with my own money first." Boone watched her with something approaching admiration. Here was a woman who understood pride, who knew that accepting help was one thing, but maintaining dignity was another entirely. "Very well," he said, "but I insist on advancing you the first week's wages so you can stock up properly." He placed a gold coin beside her 17 cents, more money than Eliza had seen in months. "Consider it a business investment in proper meals." As Grimsby bustled about gathering supplies with newfound enthusiasm, wrapping flour and lard and coffee in brown paper with exaggerated care, Eliza felt the first stirring of something she'd thought lost forever. Hope. But hope, she had learned, was a dangerous companion. She'd hoped when she married Thomas, hoped when they'd come to Dustwell, hoped each time he'd promised to stop gambling, to start fresh, to be the man she believed he could become. Hope had been her constant betrayer, leading her down paths that ended in disappointment and despair. "Mr. Carver," she said quietly as Grimsby moved out of earshot. "Why are you doing this? You don't know me, don't know what kind of person I am or what troubles I might bring to your door." Boone was silent for a long moment, watching Grimsby stack supplies with theatrical precision. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of old grief. 2 years ago, my wife Sarah died of fever. Before she passed, she made me promise something." He paused, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. "She said I wasn't to let grief turn me mean, wasn't to let wealth make me indifferent to suffering. She said if I ever had the chance to help someone the way I wished someone had helped us when we were starting out, I should take it." He turned to meet Eliza's eyes. "I've been breaking that promise for 2 years now, Mrs. Granger. Watched this town struggle, watched good people suffer, and done nothing because I was too wrapped up in my own pain to see beyond it. Today, watching you in that street, I realized I was becoming the kind of man Sarah would have been ashamed to know." Eliza felt tears prick at her eyes, not from pity, but from recognition. Here was someone who understood loss, who carried grief like a stone in his chest just as she did. "And what if I'm not what you need?" she asked. "What if I disappoint you?" "Then we'll figure it out as we go," Boone replied simply. "But I have a feeling that won't be the case." Grimsby approached with arms full of packages, his smile now wide enough to split his narrow face. "Here we are. Finest flour, pure lard, coffee beans, sugar, beans, and I threw in some salt pork at no extra charge. Always happy to serve the Carver ranch." Eliza watched this transformation with bitter amusement. The same man who'd thrown her into the street now treated her like visiting royalty, all because of the tall man standing beside her. It was a lesson in the currency of association, the way respect could be borrowed rather than earned. As they left the store, Eliza carrying packages that felt heavier with possibility than with actual weight, she caught sight of her reflection in the storefront window. The woman looking back at her had dirt on her dress and tangles in her hair, but something had changed in her face. The defeated slump of her shoulders had straightened into something resembling hope. "Mrs. Granger," Boone said as they reached his horse, a magnificent black gelding that probably cost more than most people's homes, "there's something else you should know about my offer." Eliza's heart sank. Here came the conditions, the expectations that would make his generosity feel like a trap. "My ranch is 15 miles north of town," he continued, "and once winter sets in, trips to town become irregular. You'd be somewhat isolated with only me and my foreman Ezra for company most days. It's not an easy life for a woman accustomed to neighbors and social calls." "Mr. Carver," Eliza said, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth, "I've been living alone in a one-room cabin, eating wild onions and water soup, with the whole town pretending I don't exist. Isolation doesn't frighten me. Indifference does." Boone nodded, understanding passing between them like a current. He untied his horse and swung into the saddle with the easy grace of a man born to it. "I'll send Ezra to town tomorrow with a wagon," he said. "He'll help you gather your things and bring you out to the ranch. That'll give you tonight to think it over. Make sure it's what you want. And if I change my mind, then Ezra will bring you back to town, no questions asked, and you'll keep the supplies either way." As Boone rode away, dust trailing behind his horse like a banner, Eliza stood in the street clutching her packages and feeling the weight of possibility settling on her shoulders. For the first time in 3 years, tomorrow felt like something more than just another day to survive. But as she walked home to her small cabin, the torn piece of her dress fluttering in the evening breeze. She couldn't shake the feeling that accepting Boone Carver's kindness would cost her something she hadn't yet calculated. In her experience, men didn't offer sanctuary without expecting something in return, and she had learned to be wary of gifts that seemed too good to be true. The inciting incident had been set in motion, not just by Grimsby's cruelty or Boone's kindness, but by Eliza's decision to trust impossibility one more time, despite every lesson her hard life had taught her about the danger of hope. The Carver ranch sprawled across the horizon like a promise made manifest. Eliza sat beside Ezra Mueller on the wagon bench, her few belongings secured in the bed behind them, and tried to comprehend the scope of what she was seeing. Rolling pastures stretched toward distant hills, dotted with cattle that looked like toy figures from this distance. Fences ran straight and true, speaking of careful planning and abundant resources. Ezra was a man of perhaps 50, weathered as old leather but with kind eyes that crinkled at the corners when he smiled. He'd arrived in town that morning with a sturdy wagon and a gentle manner, treating Eliza's meager possessions as if they were precious cargo. "Been working for Mr. Carver nigh on 12 years now," he'd told her as they loaded her trunk. A battered thing that had belonged to her grandmother and contained everything she owned worth keeping. Good man to work for. Fair, honest, doesn't ask more than he's willing to give himself. Now, as the main house came into view, Eliza felt her breath catch in her throat. It wasn't a mansion by Eastern standards, but it was substantial. 2 stories of solid timber and stone with a wide porch that wrapped around 3 sides and windows that spoke of comfort and permanence. Outbuildings dotted the immediate area, a barn large enough to house a dozen horses, bunkhouses for the ranch hands, corrals, and various sheds whose purposes she could only guess at. Mr. Carver built most of this himself, Ezra said, following her gaze. Started with nothing but a land grant and determination, every board, every stone placed with his own hands until he could afford to hire help. They pulled up before the main house just as Boone emerged from the barn, brushing hay from his shirt sleeves. In daylight, away from the tension of town, Eliza could see him more clearly. He moved with the easy confidence of a man comfortable in his own skin, but there was a carefulness to his manner that spoke of recent grief still held close. "Mrs. Granger," he said, approaching the wagon with his hat in his hands. "Welcome to the Carver ranch. I hope the journey wasn't too uncomfortable." "Not at all, Mr. Carver. Ezra was excellent company." She accepted his hand as he helped her down from the wagon, noticing the calluses that spoke of work despite his wealth. "Your ranch is magnificent." "Thank you. It's been a good life here. Or was, until recently." A shadow passed across his features before he seemed to shake it off. "Come, let me show you the house." Inside, Eliza's first impression was of space and light. The main room featured a stone fireplace large enough to roast a whole steer, comfortable furniture arranged for conversation rather than display, and windows that invited the prairie inside. But there was also a masculine starkness to it, as if the feminine touches had been carefully removed rather than simply absent. "Your room is upstairs," Boone said, leading her up a staircase whose banister gleamed with regular care. "It has its own window facing east, so you'll catch the morning sun." The room he showed her was larger than her entire cabin had been, with a real bed, not a cot or a pallet on the floor, and a dresser with an actual mirror. A washstand held a pitcher and basin of fine porcelain, and a small rocking chair sat by the window, positioned to catch both light and view. "This was—" Boone began, then stopped. "This is yours now. Make whatever changes you need to feel comfortable." Eliza walked to the window and looked out over the ranch spread before her. In the distance, she could see cowboys working with the horses in the corrals, their movements choreographed with the precision of long practice. It was a world completely foreign to her experience, yet something about its purposefulness appealed to her. "Mr. Carver," she said, turning from the window, "I need to understand what's expected of me here. You mentioned cooking and housekeeping. But I sense there's more to this arrangement than simple employment. Boone leaned against the door frame, his expression thoughtful. You're right to ask. The truth is, I'm not entirely sure myself what I'm hoping for. This house has been too quiet for too long, too empty of life and purpose, beyond mere existence. I suppose I'm hoping that having someone here who understands the value of small things might remind me how to live instead of simply enduring. It was an honest answer, more honest than Eliza had expected, and it revealed a vulnerability that made her both grateful and cautious. In her experience, men who showed their weaknesses too readily were either saints or predators, and she'd met precious few saints. I'll do my best to earn my keep, she said carefully. But I should tell you that my cooking skills are limited to simple fare. I've had little opportunity to practice with fine ingredients or elaborate meals. Simple fare sounds like paradise after 2 years of my own attempts, Boone replied with what might have been his first genuine smile since his wife's death. Come, let me show you the kitchen, and then you can decide if this arrangement might work for both of us. The kitchen was a revelation. A large iron stove dominated one wall, with ovens big enough to feed a crew of ranch hands. Shelves lined with dishes, pots and utensils spoke of meals meant to nourish rather than simply sustain. A pantry off the main room was stocked with supplies that would have fed Eliza for months back in town. Sarah loved to cook, Boone said quietly, running his hand along the smooth surface of a well-worn cutting board. She said a kitchen was the heart of a home, that you could measure a family's happiness by how much laughter echoed off these walls. Eliza picked up a wooden spoon, worn smooth by years of use, and felt the weight of expectation settling on her shoulders. This wasn't just about preparing meals. She was being asked to somehow restore life to a house that had forgotten how to be a home. I'm not her, Eliza said gently but firmly. I can't replace what you've lost, Mr. Carver. I'm not asking you to, he replied, though something in his voice suggested he wasn't entirely certain of that himself. I'm asking you to help me figure out how to move forward without betraying what I've lost. That evening, as Eliza prepared her first meal in the Carver kitchen, a simple supper of beans, bacon, and cornbread, she reflected on the strange turn her life had taken. 24 hours ago, she'd been scraping together coins for flour. Now she stood in a kitchen that could provision half the town, working for a man whose grief seemed as vast as his generosity. But as the sense of cooking food filled the air and Boone appeared in the doorway drawn by hunger or hope or simple loneliness, Eliza realized that this arrangement would test them both in ways neither had anticipated. He needed more than a housekeeper, and she needed more than employment. They needed healing, though neither was ready to admit it. The first week at the Carver Ranch passed like a careful dance between two people learning each other's rhythms. Eliza rose before dawn each morning, as had been her habit during the lean years, and found comfort in the routine of preparing breakfast for Boone and the ranch hands, who gathered in the large dining room adjacent to the kitchen. Simple meals, eggs, bacon, hot cakes when supplies allowed, but served hot and with care. Boone proved to be a considerate employer, asking little beyond basic meals and keeping the house tidy. He worked from dawn until well past dusk, throwing himself into ranch business with the intensity of a man trying to outrun his thoughts. But Eliza noticed things, how he paused at the threshold of certain rooms as if gathering courage to enter, how his eyes would drift to empty spaces where photographs might once have stood, how he sometimes forgot to come in for meals until she rang the dinner bell twice. It was Thursday evening when she discovered the locked room. She'd been dusting the upstairs hallway, working by lamplight as shadows gathered outside the windows, when she tried the handle of a door she'd assumed led to a storage closet. It was locked, but through the keyhole came the faint scent of lavender, not the fresh herb, but the lingering memory of it, like perfume clinging to clothing long after its wearer has gone. That was Sarah's room, Boone's voice came from behind her, soft but carrying a weight that made Eliza's hand freeze on the door handle. Her sewing room, where she kept her quilts and patterns and all the things that made her happy. Eliza turned slowly, seeing him standing at the top of the stairs with a cup of coffee growing cold in his hands. His face held the careful blankness of a man who'd practiced hiding his pain. "I'm sorry," she said. "I was just cleaning. I didn't mean to pry." "It's all right." He moved closer, stopping just out of reach. "I locked it up after she died. Couldn't bear to see it empty. Couldn't bear to see it full of her things either. Ezra thinks I should give her belongings to the church ladies, let them go to folks who need them." "And what do you think?" Boone was quiet for a long moment, studying the locked door as if it might hold answers to questions he'd stopped asking. "I think grief makes cowards of us all," he said finally. "I think I've been hiding from life instead of living it, and Sarah would have been ashamed of the man I've become." Eliza set down her dust cloth and faced him fully. "Mr. Carver, in my experience, grief doesn't follow a schedule. There's no proper time to heal, no right way to honor what we've lost. Sometimes the kindest thing we can do for ourselves is simply survive until surviving becomes living again." Something shifted in his expression, a crack in the careful control he maintained. "How do you know when that happens? When survival becomes living?" "I think it's different for everyone," Eliza said carefully. "For me, it was when I realized that Thomas wouldn't have wanted me to stop hoping for better things just because he was gone. He made mistakes. Lord knows he made plenty. But he loved life, loved possibility. He'd have been heartbroken to see me giving up on both." They stood in the hallway, lamplight flickering between them, sharing the kind of honesty that comes easier in shadows than in bright daylight. "Sarah used to say that love wasn't something you stopped doing when someone died," Boone said quietly. "She said it was something you learned to do differently, to carry forward instead of holding back." She sounds like a wise woman. She was. He touched the door gently, like a blessing or a goodbye. "She also would have liked you, I think. Would have appreciated how you've brought care back to this house without trying to erase what came before." It was a compliment that warmed Eliza more than she expected, but also one that carried weight. She was beginning to understand that her role here wasn't simply that of an employee. She was part of Boone's attempt to re-engage with life, a test of whether he could open his heart to new possibilities without betraying old loyalties. The next morning brought unexpected visitors. Eliza was hanging laundry when she heard the sound of approaching horses and looked up to see 3 riders coming up the ranch road. They moved with purpose, and something in their manner made her step closer to the house. Boone emerged from the barn as the riders drew up before the main house. The leader was a man Eliza recognized from town, Marcus Webb, who owned the saloon and had a reputation for sharp dealing and short temper. "Carver," Webb called out without dismounting. "We need to talk." "Then talk," Boone replied, his voice carefully neutral. Webb glanced meaningfully at Eliza, then back at Boone. "Private business." "Mrs. Granger works for me," Boone said. "Anything you have to say can be said in front of her." Webb's expression darkened. "Have it your way. Word in town is you're getting soft, Carver. Taking in strays, playing the good Samaritan. Some folks are wondering if you've lost your edge for business." "What folks?" "The kind who matter when it comes to cattle contracts and railroad deals. The kind who don't much like uncertainty in their business partners." Eliza felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. This was about her, about Boone's decision to help her. She was becoming a liability, a mark against his reputation that could cost him more than money. "I appreciate your concern for my business interests," Boone said, his tone growing cooler, "but I don't recall asking for advice on how to run my ranch or my life." "Just friendly counsel," Webb replied, but his smile was anything but friendly. "Might be wise to remember that charity can be expensive when it affects other people's profits." As the riders departed, Eliza felt the first real complication of her new life settling around her like a closing trap. Her presence here wasn't just changing Boone's daily routine. It was challenging the social order that kept Dustwell running, threatening relationships he'd built over years of careful business. Standing in the doorway with Sarah's wooden spoon still in her hand, Eliza realized that accepting Boone's kindness had set forces in motion that neither of them had anticipated, and the cost of their arrangement was only beginning to reveal itself. 3 weeks into September, the first hard frost painted the ranch in silver and changed everything. Eliza woke to the sound of urgent voices in the yard below her window and hurried to dress before making her way downstairs. Through the kitchen window, she could see Boone and Ezra standing near the horse corrals, their breath visible in the cold air as they talked in low, serious tones. She had coffee brewing, and breakfast started when Boone came through the back door, his face grim with worry. "We've got trouble," he said without preamble. "Lost 12 head of cattle overnight. Found them this morning in Devil's Canyon, shot clean through." Eliza's hands stilled on the cast iron skillet she'd been heating. Shot? Not killed by wolves or disease? No, this was deliberate, professional, someone who knew exactly what they were doing and wanted to send a message. Boone poured himself coffee with hands that weren't quite steady. In 20 years of ranching, I've never had cattle rustled from my land. Never had anyone bold enough to try. Who would do such a thing? Boone's jaw tightened. Someone who wants to make a point about the cost of crossing certain people. Someone who thinks I've forgotten which side my bread is buttered on. The implication hit Eliza like a physical blow. This was about her, about Boone's decision to help her despite Marcus Webb's warning. She set down the skillet and turned to face him fully. "Mr. Carver, if my presence here is causing you trouble, don't." His voice cut through her words like a blade. "Don't you dare blame yourself for the actions of men too cowardly to face their problems head on. This is about fear and greed and the kind of thinking that says a man's only worth what he can be forced to pay." But even as he spoke, Eliza could see the calculation in his eyes. 12 head of prime cattle represented significant money, and if this was just the beginning, if whoever was responsible decided to escalate their campaign of intimidation, the losses could mount quickly. "What will you do?" she asked. "What I should have done years ago," Boone replied, his voice carrying a hardness she hadn't heard before. "Stop pretending that keeping my head down and minding my own business will protect what I've built. Some fights come to you whether you want them or not." That afternoon brought more bad news. Ezra returned from town with word that 2 of Boone's biggest cattle buyers, men who dealt with the Carver ranch for over a decade, had suddenly found other suppliers. No explanations, no apologies, just curt notes canceling contracts worth thousands of dollars. "It's Webb," Ezra said as they sat around the kitchen table, the remains of a tense dinner growing cold between them. "Has to be. He's got connections to most of the major buyers between here and Fort Worth. Probably calling in favors, making threats, doing whatever it takes to squeeze you out." "But why?" Eliza asked. "What does he gain from destroying Mr. Carver's business?" Boone and Ezra exchanged a look that held years of shared knowledge and unspoken understanding. "Webb's been trying to buy my land for 5 years, Boone explained. "Wants to consolidate several ranches into one massive operation, bring in Eastern investors and industrial methods. I've been the holdout, the one property he can't acquire because I won't sell at any price." "And now he thinks you're vulnerable," Eliza said, understanding flooding through her. "He thinks that helping me shows weakness, that maybe you can be pressured into making other compromises." "More than that," Ezra added grimly. "He thinks having you here gives him leverage, ways to apply pressure that don't involve direct confrontation." As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of approaching horses echoed from the front yard. But this time it wasn't 3 riders. It was a dozen, moving with military precision toward the main house. Boone rose from his chair, his hand instinctively moving to the gun belt he'd taken to wearing since the cattle killing. "Ezra, get Mrs. Granger upstairs. Lock the door and don't come down no matter what you hear." I'm not hiding while you face whatever this is, Eliza said, standing as well. If this is about me, I should be here. It's not about you, Boone said firmly. It's about men who think they can take whatever they want through intimidation and violence, and I'll be damned if I let them use you as a weapon against me. The riders pulled up in front of the house, their horses blowing steam in the cold air. Marcus Webb sat at their head, flanked by men Eliza didn't recognize, hard-faced individuals whose very presence spoke of violence held barely in check. "Evening, Carver," Webb called out, his voice carrying false cheer that fooled no one. "Heard you had some trouble with your stock. Thought I'd ride out and offer my condolences." Boone stepped onto the front porch, Ezra beside him, both men alert and ready. "Thoughtful of you, Marcus, though I notice you brought quite a crowd for a condolence call." "Dangerous times," Webb replied with a shrug. "Man can't be too careful when there are rustlers about. Speaking of which, I've been thinking about our previous conversation, about charity and its costs." "Have you now?" "Indeed. And I've come to realize that sometimes a man needs more direct counsel to see the error of his ways." Webb's gaze moved to the house, searching the windows as if looking for something specific. "I understand you've taken in a certain widow woman. Admirable Christian charity, though I wonder if you've considered the full implications of that decision." Eliza felt her blood turn to ice. Through the upstairs window where she was watching, despite Boone's instructions, she could see the calculation in Webb's eyes, the predatory satisfaction of a man who thought he held all the advantages. "My household arrangements are my business," Boone said, his voice carrying deadly quiet. "Of course they are, though it's interesting how quickly a man's reputation can change based on the company he keeps. How business relationships that took years to build can crumble overnight when people lose confidence in a man's judgment." The threat was clear, delivered with the polished cruelty of a man who enjoyed his power. But something in Boone's posture suggested he'd reached the end of his patience with subtle intimidation. "Marcus," he said, stepping to the edge of the porch, "I'm going to say this once, and I want you to listen carefully. Take your men and ride off my land. Don't come back unless you're invited, and if I lose so much as one more head of cattle to mysterious circumstances, or if any harm comes to anyone, under my protection, I'll hold you personally responsible." Webb's smile widened, but his eyes remained cold. "Strong words, Carver. I hope you're prepared to back them up." As the riders departed, their message delivered, Eliza realized that the careful peace of the last few weeks had been nothing more than the calm before a storm that was now gathering with deadly intent. The attacks escalated with methodical precision over the following days. First, someone cut the fence lines on the eastern pasture, allowing 50 head of cattle to wander onto neighboring land, where they had to be retrieved at considerable expense and embarrassment. Then the grain delivery from town arrived spoiled, forcing Boone to make emergency arrangements at twice the normal cost. Each incident was small enough to be dismissed as bad luck or coincidence, but together they formed a pattern of harassment designed to bleed money and morale. Eliza watched Boone grow more haggard with each passing day, the weight of responsibility and frustration carving new lines around his eyes. He'd begun sleeping poorly, rising before dawn to ride the boundaries of his property, checking for signs of further sabotage. The easy confidence she'd first observed in him was being systematically worn away, replaced by the vigilant wariness of a man under siege. It was during one of these early morning rides that he discovered the most devastating attack yet. Eliza was kneading bread dough when she heard his horse thundering back toward the house, ridden harder than any animal should be pushed. She wiped flour from her hands and stepped onto the back porch, immediately sensing that something had gone terribly wrong. Boone dismounted while his horse was still moving, his face pale beneath the morning stubble. "Ezra," he shouted toward the bunkhouse, "get the men together now." "What is it?" Eliza called out. But Boone was already striding toward the barn, his movements tight with barely controlled fury. Ezra emerged from the bunkhouse at a run, followed by the 3 ranch hands who'd been preparing for the day's work. Whatever they saw in Boone's face made them move with sudden urgency. "Someone poisoned the well at the north pasture," Boone announced without preamble. "Found 6 steers dead around the waterhole, and God knows how many more are affected. We need to move every animal away from that water source and get the veterinarian out here immediately." The words hit like physical blows. Poisoning water sources wasn't just an attack on Boone's livelihood. It was an act of such callous disregard for animal welfare that it crossed every line of decency recognized by ranching communities. "Jesus," Ezra breathed. "What kind of man poisons cattle? That's not business. That's pure evil." As the men rode out to deal with the immediate crisis, Eliza found herself alone with thoughts that grew darker with each passing minute. This wasn't random harassment anymore. This was warfare, and she was the cause. Every attack, every loss, every moment of anguish Boone endured could be traced back to his decision to help her. The guilt sat in her stomach like a stone, heavy and inescapable. When Boone returned that evening, exhausted and covered in dust, she was waiting for him on the front porch with a decision she'd been wrestling with all day. "How many?" she asked as he climbed the steps. 8 dead, another dozen sick but likely to recover. He sank into the chair beside her, suddenly looking every one of his 35 years and several more besides. "The veterinarian says it was strychnine, a deliberate, calculated dose designed to kill slowly and painfully." "Mr. Carver," Eliza said, her voice steady despite the turmoil in her chest, "this has to stop. I can't continue to be the reason you're losing everything you've worked for." Boone's head came up sharply. "Don't start down that path, Mrs. Granger. This isn't about you. It's about men who think they can take whatever they want through cruelty and intimidation." "It is about me," she insisted. "Marcus Webb made that clear. He's using me as a weapon against you, and every day I stay here gives him more ammunition. I won't be responsible for destroying what you and Sarah built together. Sarah would be ashamed of me if I let bullies drive me into abandoning someone who needs help." Boone's voice carried a heat that surprised them both. She'd say that backing down now would be the same as admitting that kindness is a luxury only rich men can afford, and that poor folks don't deserve protection from predators. And what would she say about watching you lose everything because your pride won't let you make the practical choice? The question hung between them like a challenge, forcing Boone to confront the conflict between his principles and the growing cost of maintaining them. "She'd say," he replied slowly, "that some things are worth losing everything for, that a man who won't stand up for what's right when it costs him something isn't a man worth being." But even as he spoke, Eliza could see the doubt creeping into his eyes. The losses were mounting faster than he'd anticipated, and Webb's campaign was proving more effective than either of them had expected. How long could principle sustain them against systematic destruction? That night, unable to sleep, Eliza found herself wandering the house like a restless spirit. Her steps led her inevitably to the locked door of Sarah's sewing room, where she stood listening to the silence and wondering what advice a dead woman might offer to the living. "I don't know what to do," she whispered to the darkness. "I don't know how to help him without destroying him." It was then that she noticed something she'd missed before. A thin line of light beneath the door, as if someone had left a lamp burning inside the locked room. Her heart hammered as she knelt and peered through the keyhole, expecting to see empty darkness, but finding instead the soft glow of candlelight. "She would have told you to trust him." Eliza spun around to find Boone standing at the top of the stairs, fully dressed despite the late hour. His face was shadowed, but his voice carried a gentleness she hadn't heard since that first day in town. "I beg your pardon?" "Sarah. If you could ask her what to do, she would have told you to trust that I'm strong enough to make my own choices about what's worth fighting for." He moved closer, stopping just out of reach. She would have said that running away to protect someone else's feelings is just another kind of selfishness. "And what do you say?" Boone was quiet for a long moment, studying the locked door as if it might reveal answers to questions he'd been asking for 2 years. I say that tomorrow I ride into town and make it clear to Marcus Webb that his war isn't with you, it's with me. And I'm done pretending that staying peaceful will keep either of us safe. In the flickering candlelight that somehow emanated from behind the locked door, Eliza saw something shift in Boone's expression, a hardening of resolve that spoke of bridges burned and lines drawn. Whatever came next would determine not just their futures, but the kind of people they chose to be when choosing became a luxury they could no longer afford. Boone's trip to town the next morning was meant to be a declaration of war, a direct confrontation with Marcus Webb that would put an end to the escalating campaign of terror. What he discovered instead changed everything. He'd ridden straight to Webb's saloon, prepared for the kind of showdown that would either solve their problems or make them dramatically worse. But Webb wasn't there. According to the nervous bartender, he'd left town 3 days earlier on urgent business and wasn't expected back for a week. It was while Boone stood in the empty saloon, frustration mounting, that Harold Grimsby approached him with the furtive manner of a man carrying dangerous secrets. "Mr. Carver," Grimsby whispered, glancing around to ensure they weren't overheard. "I need to speak with you, privately, about Mrs. Granger." Boone's blood chilled. "What about Mrs. Granger?" "Not here," Grimsby hissed. "Meet me behind the church in 10 minutes, and come alone." Against his better judgment, Boone found himself walking through the cemetery 10 minutes later, past weathered headstones that marked the passage of people who'd lived and died without ever facing the kind of moral complexity that now threatened to consume him. Grimsby was waiting in the shadow of the church bell tower, wringing his hands like a man confessing sins to an absent priest. "I should have told you from the beginning," Grimsby began without preamble. "Should have warned you what you were getting into when you took up for that woman." "Warned me about what?" "About who she really is. About what her husband was mixed up in before he died." Grimsby's voice dropped even lower. "Thomas Granger wasn't just a gambler, Mr. Carver. He was Marcus Webb's partner in a scheme to defraud cattle buyers throughout the territory. Been skimming money from legitimate sales and selling stolen beef to buyers who didn't ask questions." Boone felt the ground shift beneath his feet. "That's impossible. Eliza would have known." "Would she?" Grimsby interrupted. "Or would she have been smart enough to play the innocent widow while sitting on information that could destroy half the ranches in 3 counties? You're suggesting that Eliza—" "I'm not suggesting anything. I'm telling you what I know." Grimsby pulled a folded paper from his coat pocket. "This here's a letter Thomas Granger wrote to Webb just before he died. Found it in Webb's office when I was there on business last week. Read it yourself." With hands that trembled slightly, Boone unfolded the paper and read words that seemed to rewrite everything he thought he knew about the woman he'd been protecting. "Webb. The widow knows about the Silver Creek operation and the doctored bills of sale. If anything happens to me, she's got evidence enough to hang us all. Treat her right, or she'll bring down the whole network. She's smarter than she lets on, and she's got more spine than you think. T.G." "It's dated just 2 days before Thomas died," Grimsby said quietly. "Mrs. Granger has been sitting on evidence of Webb's cattle fraud operation for 3 years. Evidence that could destroy him and every rancher who's been unknowingly selling through his network." Boone stared at the letter, his mind reeling. If this is true, then why hasn't she used it? Why let herself live in poverty when she could have? "Because she's been waiting," Grimsby said. "Waiting for the right moment, the right leverage. And then you came along, a rich rancher with a reputation for honesty, someone who could give her protection while she figured out how to cash in her knowledge." The implications crashed over Boone like a wave. If Grimsby was right, then everything about their relationship was built on deception. Eliza's poverty, her gratitude, her apparent vulnerability, all of it could be an elaborate performance designed to manipulate him into providing exactly what she needed: protection, resources, and legitimacy. But even as part of his mind accepted this possibility, another part rebelled against it. He'd seen Eliza's genuine surprise at the abundance in his kitchen, witnessed her careful pride in paying for supplies with her own meager coins. Either she was a masterful actress, or there were pieces to this puzzle that Grimsby either didn't know or wasn't sharing. "Why are you telling me this?" Boone asked. "Because Webb's not just trying to drive you out of business, he's trying to silence the one person who can expose his operation. He knows Mrs. Granger has that evidence, and he knows that as long as she's under your protection, he can't get to her directly. So he's been trying to force you to give her up by making it too expensive to keep her safe. And you believe she's been manipulating me from the beginning?" Grimsby shrugged. "I believe people do what they have to do to survive. Question is, are you willing to bet everything you own on a woman who might not be what she seems?" Boone rode back to the ranch in a daze, the letter burning like a coal in his shirt pocket. Every conversation he'd had with Eliza, every moment of apparent honesty and vulnerability, now carried the shadow of possible deception. Had her tears been real or calculated? Was her gratitude genuine or performed? But as he approached the house and saw her hanging laundry in the afternoon sun, moving with the unconscious grace of someone at peace with honest work, he found himself caught between competing truths. Either she was the innocent victim he'd believed her to be, or she was playing a game so sophisticated that even he couldn't see through it. "How was town?" Eliza asked as he dismounted, her smile warm and welcoming. But now even her smile seemed suspect, loaded with potential meanings he'd been blind to before. "Informative," he said carefully, studying her face for any sign of deception or calculation. "Marcus Webb wasn't there. Seems he's been called away on business. That's good news, isn't it? Perhaps his absence will give us some peace to figure out our next step." "Perhaps." Boone pulled the letter from his pocket, watching her face carefully. "Eliza, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." She must have sensed the change in his tone because her expression grew cautious. "Of course. What is it?" "Did your husband ever mention a man named Marcus Webb? Any business dealings they might have had together?" The change in her expression was subtle but unmistakable. A slight tightening around her eyes, a barely perceptible stiffening of her shoulders. For just a moment, the mask of innocence slipped, revealing something more complex beneath. "Why do you ask?" she said carefully. "Because I've come across information suggesting that Thomas was involved in some questionable business practices. Information that might explain why Webb has been so determined to drive us apart." Eliza was silent for a long moment, her hands stilling on the clothesline. When she spoke, her voice carried a weariness that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside. "Mr. Carver, there are things about my marriage, about Thomas, that I haven't told you, things I hoped I'd never have to tell anyone." She turned to face him fully, and for the first time since he'd known her, her expression held no trace of deference or uncertainty. "But I think the time for keeping secrets may be over." As the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the ranch yard, Boone realized that everything he thought he knew about Eliza Granger was about to be rewritten, and the woman he'd been protecting might be far more dangerous and far more valuable than he'd ever imagined. They sat across from each other at the kitchen table as the sun set behind the hills, the letter spread between them like a map of betrayal. Eliza's hands were folded in her lap, steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to reveal, while Boone struggled with the collision between his heart and his growing suspicion. "You're right," Eliza began, her voice quiet but clear. "Thomas was involved with Marcus Webb in cattle fraud. But the letter doesn't tell the whole truth, and neither did Grimsby." She rose from her chair and walked to the window, staring out at the darkening pastures where Boone's cattle grazed in peaceful ignorance of the storm gathering around them. Thomas wasn't Webb's partner. He was his victim. Webb discovered that Thomas had gambling debts all over the territory, debts that could have landed him in prison or worse. So Webb made him an offer. Help falsify cattle sales records and shipping manifests, or face the consequences of his debts being called in by some very dangerous men. Boone felt something cold settle in his chest. And you knew about this? Not at first. Thomas tried to hide it, tried to pretend that the extra money was coming from good luck at cards or smart business deals. But a wife knows when her husband is lying, especially when the lies start eating him alive. She turned back to face him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. By the time I figured out what was really happening, Thomas was in so deep that trying to get out would have meant death for both of us. So you said nothing. I said nothing while he was alive because I was terrified. But after he died, I did something that Webb doesn't know about. Eliza walked to the old coffee tin that sat on the kitchen shelf and removed a small key from inside. I kept records of everything Thomas told me. Names, dates, amounts, shipping routes, everything I could remember about Webb's operation. She moved to the pantry and knelt beside a loose floorboard Boone had never noticed. The key opened a small metal box hidden beneath, from which she withdrew a leather portfolio tied with string. 3 years' worth of evidence, she said, placing the portfolio on the table between them. Enough to send Webb to prison and implicate every rancher who knowingly participated in selling stolen cattle, including some men you consider friends. Boone's throat went dry. Who? Better you see for yourself. Eliza untied the portfolio and spread its contents across the table, page after page of careful handwriting, documenting a network of corruption that stretched far beyond what he'd imagined possible. Names leaped out at him from the pages. John Patterson, who'd sold cattle through Webb's network for years. Samuel Morrison, whose ranch bordered Boone's to the west. Even Harold Grimsby appeared in the records, having accepted payment to falsify shipping weights and destinations. Good God, Boone breathed, recognizing the scope of what Eliza had been carrying alone. This could destroy half the cattle operations in 3 counties. Which is exactly why Webb wants it so badly, and why he's been so desperate to get me away from your protection. Eliza's voice carried a bitter edge. He knows I have this evidence, but he doesn't know where I've hidden it. Thomas died before he could tell Webb about our arrangement, that if anything happened to Thomas, I would take everything to the territorial authorities. But you didn't. No, I didn't. She sank back into her chair, suddenly looking older than her 28 years. Because I'm a coward, Mr. Carver. Because I was terrified that exposing Webb would also destroy innocent people who got caught up in his schemes without knowing what they were really part of. And because I was afraid that no one would believe the word of a poor widow against established businessmen. Boone studied the document spread before him, each page representing hours of careful documentation and enormous personal risk. Why are you showing me this now? Because Webb's escalation means he's getting desperate. The poisoned cattle, the systematic harassment, those aren't the actions of a man who thinks he can wait for a better opportunity. He's going to make a direct move soon, and when he does, people are going to get hurt. What kind of direct move? Eliza met his eyes across the table, and he saw fear there, not for herself, but for him. Thomas once told me that Webb has contacts among some very dangerous men. Gunfighters, claim jumpers, the kind of people who solve problems with violence when intimidation fails. If Webb thinks he can't pressure you into abandoning me, he'll find another way to get what he wants. The implications settled over Boone like a shroud. He'd been thinking of their conflict as a business dispute, a matter of economic pressure and social maneuvering. But if Eliza was right, they were facing something far more deadly. There's something else, Eliza continued, her voice dropping even lower. Something I discovered just before Thomas died. Webb isn't just stealing cattle. He's been using the fraudulent sales to launder money from other criminal enterprises. Bank robberies, stagecoach holdups, even some of the Indian raids that have been plaguing isolated ranches. He takes the stolen money, converts it into fake cattle sales, and emerges with clean profit and legitimate business records. Boone felt the world tilt beneath him. You're talking about a criminal network that goes far beyond cattle fraud. I'm talking about an organization that's been operating under everyone's noses for years, protected by Webb's reputation as a legitimate businessman and the involvement of prominent ranchers who don't even know they're part of it. The silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of revelation and the growing certainty that their situation was far more dangerous than either had realized. "Why didn't you tell me this from the beginning?" Boone asked finally. "Because I was afraid you'd send me away. Afraid that knowing the truth would make you decide I wasn't worth the risk." Eliza's voice broke slightly. "And because I was hoping that maybe, somehow, I could start over without having to drag all this darkness into a new life." Boone rose from his chair and walked to the window, staring out at his land. The acres he'd worked and fought for, the cattle that represented years of honest labor, the home he'd built with Sarah's love and his own sweat, all of it now threatened by forces he'd never seen coming. "What do you want to do?" he asked without turning around. "I want to take this evidence to the territorial marshal and let justice take its course. But I know that doing so will destroy innocent people along with the guilty ones. And I know it will probably get us both killed before we can make it to the authorities. And if we do nothing, Webb will keep escalating until he gets what he wants, either the evidence or our deaths. There's no middle ground with men like him." Boone turned back to face her, seeing her clearly for perhaps the first time since they'd met. Not a helpless widow in need of rescue, but a woman who'd been fighting a war she couldn't win, carrying burdens that would have crushed most people, maintaining her dignity and humanity despite circumstances that would have justified bitterness and despair. "Eliza," he said, using her first name for the first time, "I need you to understand something. What you've just told me doesn't change how I feel about helping you. It doesn't make me regret standing up to Webb or taking you in. If anything, it makes me more determined to see this through. Even knowing the cost? Especially knowing the cost." Boone moved closer to the table, his hands resting on the evidence that would either save them or destroy them. Sarah always said that the measure of a person isn't whether they make mistakes, but whether they're willing to pay the price to make things right. You've been carrying this burden alone for 3 years, trying to find a way to do the right thing without destroying innocent people. That takes more courage than I think I possess. So what do we do? Boone looked down at the documents, then up at the woman who'd trusted him with secrets that could get them both killed. We do what should have been done 3 years ago. We take this evidence to the marshal, and we let the chips fall where they may. But we do it smart, and we do it together. As if summoned by their decision, the sound of horses approaching echoed from the darkness outside. But this time, instead of a dozen riders making threats, it was a single horse moving at desperate speed. Ezra burst through the kitchen door without knocking, his face pale with urgency. "Boss," he gasped, struggling to catch his breath. "We've got company coming. At least 20 riders, armed and moving this way fast, and they're flying no flags of parley." Boone and Eliza looked at each other across the table covered with evidence, both understanding that their time for careful planning had just run out. The final confrontation was coming whether they were ready or not. The riders came out of the darkness like demons from a fever dream, their horses thundering across the range with deadly purpose. Boone counted at least 20 men, silhouetted against the star-filled sky, and knew immediately that this wasn't another intimidation visit. This was an execution squad. "Ezra, get the rifles from the gun cabinet," Boone commanded, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "Mrs. Granger, take that evidence and hide it somewhere safe. If we don't survive this, someone needs to find it." "I'm not hiding while you fight my battles," Eliza said firmly, already moving toward the cabinet where Boone kept his spare weapons. "I can shoot well enough to be useful. This isn't your fight. It became my fight the moment I decided to trust you with the truth." She pulled a Winchester from the cabinet and checked its action with practiced efficiency. "Besides, you'll need every gun you can get." Through the window, they could see the riders splitting into groups, surrounding the house with military precision. These weren't the cowboys and drifters that usually made up Webb's intimidation crews. These were professional gunfighters, men who killed for money and did it well enough to stay alive. "Boss," Ezra called from the front window, "they've got us surrounded. No way out the back without running straight into gun sights." Boone felt the familiar calm that had served him well during his younger, more dangerous days settle over his mind. He'd been in tight spots before, though never with stakes quite this high. The key was to think clearly, use every advantage, and make the other side pay dearly for whatever they took. "How many rounds do we have?" he asked, checking his own rifle. "Maybe 60 between all of us," Ezra replied. "Enough for one good fight if we make every shot count." A voice boomed from the darkness outside, amplified by the stillness of the night air. "Carver, we know you're in there, and we know you've got the woman. Send her out with whatever papers she's hiding, and the rest of you can ride away with whole skins." Boone moved to the window and called back. "I don't negotiate with night riders and back shooters. If Webb wants something from us, he can come ask for it in daylight like a man." Cold laughter echoed from multiple directions around the house. "Webb ain't here, Carver. This is just business. Ugly business, but business all the same. We're being paid to collect certain items and eliminate certain problems. Nothing personal." "Everything about this is personal," Boone replied, but he was already moving away from the window, knowing that standing in one place too long would draw rifle fire. "You've got 1 minute to think it over," the voice continued. "After that, we're coming in, and anybody standing between us and our objective is going to get buried in the morning." Eliza appeared at Boone's shoulder, the portfolio of evidence clutched in her free hand. "There's something you need to know," she whispered urgently. "Thomas once told me that Webb keeps a detailed record of everyone he's paid off, everyone he has leverage over. Names, amounts, dates, everything. If that record still exists, it's probably worth more than what I've got here. Where would he keep something like that? Safe in his office, most likely. But Thomas said Webb was paranoid about keeping all his eggs in one basket. He might have copies hidden elsewhere, insurance against anyone trying to double-cross him." A rifle shot cracked from outside, the bullet shattering a window on the far side of the house. The message was clear. Talking time was over. "Whatever we're going to do, we need to do it fast," Ezra said, dropping to one knee behind an overturned table. "They're getting ready to move." Boone's mind raced through possibilities, discarding plans as quickly as he formed them. A straight fight would favor the attackers. They had numbers, position, and the advantage of being paid to take risks rather than protecting something they cared about. But the house was solid, built to withstand prairie storms and Indian raids from earlier, more violent days, if they could hold long enough. "The root cellar," he said suddenly. "Eliza, there's a tunnel that runs from the cellar to the barn. Sarah and I built it during the Indian troubles 10 years back. You can get out that way. Take the evidence to town." "I already told you." "This isn't about bravery," Boone interrupted. "This is about making sure that evidence survives, even if we don't. Someone has to tell this story, and that someone is you." More shots erupted from outside, this time from multiple directions. The attackers were testing their defenses, looking for weak points and measuring their response. It wouldn't be long before they mounted a coordinated assault. "Go," Boone said, pressing a box of ammunition into Eliza's hands along with her rifle. "Use the tunnel. Get to town. Find Marshal Crawford and show him everything." For a moment, their eyes met across the chaos of preparation, and something passed between them, not love, exactly, but understanding, recognition of what they'd found in each other despite the circumstances that had brought them together. "Don't you dare die on me, Boone Carver," Eliza said fiercely. "Not when I've just found someone worth living for." Then she was gone, disappearing toward the cellar as the sound of running footsteps and shouted commands filled the night air outside. The attack began with the systematic precision of men who killed for a living. Gunfire erupted from 3 sides, Simultaneously, muzzle flashes lighting the darkness like deadly fireflies as bullets shattered windows and splintered door frames. Boone and Ezra returned fire from carefully chosen positions, making every shot count while conserving ammunition for the longer fight they knew was coming. "They're trying to pin us down while a team moves up from the blind side," Ezra called out between shots, his voice steady despite the circumstances. "Professional work. These ain't cowboys playing at war." Boone nodded grimly, tracking movement in the darkness beyond the coral. He'd counted muzzle flashes from at least 15 different positions, which meant the attackers had them outnumbered 3-1 even without knowing how many more might be held in reserve. A new sound cut through the gunfire, the sharp crack of splintering wood from the back of the house. They were coming through the kitchen, just as Boone had expected they would. "Watch the front," he told Ezra, then moved quickly toward the sound, his rifle ready. The first man through the kitchen door never saw what hit him. Boone's shot took him center mass, dropping him across the threshold in a way that would slow the men behind him. But even as the gunfighter fell, 2 more were pushing through, their own weapons blazing. Boone dove behind the heavy oak table Sarah had insisted they buy for family dinners they'd never lived to have. Bullets chewed chunks from the wood above his head, filling the air with splinters and the acrid smell of gunpowder. He came up firing, catching the second man in the shoulder and sending him spinning back toward the door. The third gunfighter had better cover and better reflexes. His return shot burned a groove across Boone's ribs, drawing blood and reminding him how quickly this could end. From the front of the house came the sound of breaking glass and Ezra's steady rifle fire, punctuated by curses in at least 2 languages. The old foreman was holding his ground, but Boone could hear in the rhythm of shots that he was already working his way through his ammunition faster than they could afford. A new voice called from outside, different from the one that had offered them terms earlier. "Burn them out. We're not getting paid to fight fair." The smell of coal oil reached Boone's nose even before he saw the orange glow beginning to flicker at the edges of the kitchen windows. They were splashing kerosene on the outside walls, preparing to turn the house into a funeral pyre with everyone inside. "Ezra," Boone shouted, "they're burning us out." "I know," came the reply. "Smoke's already coming through the front wall." Boone's mind raced through rapidly shrinking options. They could try to fight their way out, but that would mean abandoning the defensive advantage of the house for open ground where superior numbers would quickly overwhelm them. They could stay and fight the fire along with the gunmen, but that was a losing proposition. The attackers could wait safely outside while smoke and flames did their work. That left only one choice, and it was a desperate one. "When I give the signal," Boone called to Ezra, "we go out the front door, straight at them, fast and hard, everything we've got." "Boss, that's suicide." "Maybe, but it's the only chance we've got of taking some of them with us. And maybe, if we're lucky and hit them hard enough, some of them will decide they're not being paid enough for this kind of fight." The flames were spreading faster now, fed by dry timber and autumn wind. Smoke was beginning to fill the main room, making it hard to see and harder to breathe. Soon they'd be fighting blind, and that would be the end of everything. Boone thought of Eliza, hopefully halfway to town by now with the evidence that could end Webb's reign of terror. If she made it, if she could convince Marshal Crawford to listen, then none of this would be for nothing. But if she didn't, he pushed the thought away. Faith was a luxury he couldn't afford right now, but hope was a necessity he couldn't live without. "Ready," he called to Ezra, checking his rifle one last time. "Been ready for 20 years, boss. Let's show these bastards what honest men can do when they're pushed too far." Boone moved to the front door, feeling the heat of the flames beginning to lick at the walls behind him. Through the smoke and firelight, he could see movement in the yard, dark shapes positioning themselves for what they thought would be easy targets as burning men stumbled from a doomed house. They were about to learn differently. "Now!" Boone roared, kicking open the front door and charging into the night with a war cry that would have done his Apache fighting grandfather proud. The final battle for the Carver ranch had begun, and whether he lived or died, Boone was determined to make it a fight that would be remembered long after the smoke cleared and the dead were counted. The charge from the burning house caught the gunfighters completely off guard. They'd been positioned to pick off escaping targets, not to face a coordinated assault by men who had nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. Boone's first shot dropped the leader before he could bring his rifle to bear, while Ezra's steady marksmanship sent two more diving for cover behind water troughs and fence posts. But superior courage couldn't overcome superior numbers indefinitely. Just as the remaining attackers began to organize a counterattack that would have ended the fight, the thunder of hooves echoed from the ranch road. Not more enemy riders, but a column of men riding hard under the star-spangled banner of territorial law. Marshal Crawford led the charge, his badge glinting in the firelight as he and a dozen deputized townsmen surrounded the surviving gunfighters with practiced efficiency. Behind him rode men Boone recognized: Harold Grimsby, old Pete from the barber shop, even some of the customers who'd watched Eliza's humiliation in silence weeks earlier. "Drop your weapons," Crawford commanded, his voice carrying the absolute authority of federal law. "This is a territorial marshal's posse, and you're all under arrest for attempted murder and conspiracy." The gunfighters, caught between the burning house and overwhelming odds, chose survival over loyalty to their absent employer. Weapons clattered to the ground as hands reached skyward, the mercenary calculation that had brought them here now working against the man who'd hired them. As the deputies secured the prisoners and organized a bucket brigade to save what remained of the house, Eliza emerged from the shadows beyond the barn, still clutching the portfolio that had started everything. She moved with careful steps, as if afraid that sudden motion might shatter the fragile peace that had descended over the ranch. "The tunnel led farther than I expected," she said quietly as she approached Boone, who was accepting rough medical attention for his wounded ribs from one of the townsmen. "I made it almost to the main road before I heard the gunfire stop and saw the marshal's men arrive." "You should have kept riding," Boone said, though his relief at seeing her safe was obvious in his voice. "Should have taken that evidence straight to town like we planned." "I started to," Eliza admitted. "Got almost a mile toward Dustwell before I realized something important." She looked around at the smoking ruins of what had been a home, at the scattered bodies of men who'd died for Marcus Webb's secrets, at the faces of townspeople who'd come to help despite the danger. Running away to save evidence wouldn't mean much if there was no one left alive to benefit from the truth it contained. Marshal Crawford approached them, his expression grim but satisfied. "Mrs. Granger, I understand you have information relevant to a federal investigation into cattle fraud and money laundering?" "Yes, sir." Eliza handed him the portfolio, with hands that trembled only slightly. 3 years' worth of records documenting Marcus Webb's criminal operations, names, dates, amounts, shipping routes, everything I could gather or remember. Crawford opened the portfolio and whistled softly as he scanned the first few pages. "This is extraordinary work, ma'am. Evidence of this quality and detail will put Webb and his associates away for the rest of their lives." He looked up at her with something approaching awe. "You've been carrying this alone for 3 years?" "Not alone," Eliza said, glancing at Boone. "Not for the last month, anyway." "Well, it's over now. We've had Webb under surveillance for weeks, waiting for exactly this kind of evidence. He's already in federal custody in Fort Worth, and with what you've provided, we can roll up his entire network." Crawford closed the portfolio carefully. "There'll be a substantial reward from the territorial government, and probably more from the railroad companies once they see how much stolen money we can recover." As dawn broke over the Texas plains, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose that made even the smoking ruins look peaceful, Boone and Eliza sat on the porch steps of what remained of the main house. Around them, the townspeople were finishing the cleanup, preparing to return to Dustwell with stories that would be told for generations. "What happens now?" Eliza asked, watching Ezra direct the loading of the wounded attackers into a wagon for transport to town. "Now we rebuild," Boone said simply. The barn's intact, most of the outbuildings are fine, and the foundation of the house is solid. Won't take long to put up new walls, especially with help from folks who suddenly seem eager to lend a hand. And us? What happens to us? Boone was quiet for a moment, studying the woman who'd brought chaos and purpose back into his carefully ordered life. I was thinking that this ranch could use a partner. Someone who understands that building something worthwhile requires both courage and patience. Are you proposing a business arrangement, Mr. Carver? I'm proposing whatever arrangement you'll accept, Mrs. Granger. Business, marriage, or something we invent as we go along. The specifics matter less than the commitment to build something good together. Eliza smiled, and for the first time since he'd known her, it was a smile completely free of shadows or doubt. I think Sarah would approve. I think she would too, Boone agreed, and as he spoke the words, he realized that the locked door of grief in his heart had finally opened, not to forget what he'd lost, but to make room for what he'd found. 6 months later, the new Carver ranch house stood complete, larger than the original, and designed for a family that might grow beyond just 2 people. Above the front door, carved into a piece of oak salvaged from Sarah's dining table, were words that summarized everything Eliza and Boone had learned about the cost and value of kindness. Take my hand. You'll never go hungry again. The promise had been kept in ways neither of them had imagined when it was first spoken in the dusty street of a small Texas town. And in keeping it, they had discovered that some hungers can only be satisfied by the willingness to feed others, and some promises can only be fulfilled by having the courage to make them in the first place.